Welcome to the inaugural Jeffco Public Schools Talking Ed podcast, and I'm your host, Jason Glass, proud to be the Superintendent and Chief Learner with Jeffco Public Schools. And over the next half hour, we're going to dive into an authentic conversation about your schools and our kids' education. I'm pleased to be joined on this podcast by Jeffco's own State Representative Chris Kennedy, serving House District 23, which covers much of Lakewood as well as some parts of Golden and Green Mountain. Representative Kennedy has served in the Colorado legislature since being elected in 2016. He's a native of Colorado Springs and attended the University of Colorado at Boulder, go Buffs, where he earned a bachelor's degree in architectural engineering. And we are also joined by Ed Bowditch, who is a lobbyist with several clients, including Jeffco Public Schools. Ed has more than 20 years working in a variety of research and budget roles in state government in Colorado. He got his undergrad degree from Colorado College and also has a master's degree in public policy from Harvard. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we are glad that you're here. Ed, let's start with you. Some of our listeners might be wondering why a public school district needs a lobbyist. Tell us about that and what sort of role you play in the legislative process.
Well, thank you. And as a lobbyist for the school district, I am down at the Capitol every day the legislature is in session. Session goes January to May, 120 days, and I will be down there at the Capitol. I will be watching all the legislation on the House and the Senate floor and paying particular attention to the education committees and the budget committee. When the legislature is not in session, I'm down at the Capitol a lot as well. I was down there today, I'm down there tomorrow. Meetings with legislators, meetings with staff, trying to find out either what just happened in a session that just finished or what is likely to come up this next year, focusing on the budget. The superintendent and the school board members can't afford to be down at the Capitol every day, so that's why I'm hired. I will be in touch with you in your role as superintendent. I will be in touch with the school board members to whom I officially report, giving them reports on all the bills that have been introduced on up to a particular session, what school funding is going to look like for statewide, but also in particular for Jeffco schools. I'm in touch with the staff a lot, with your staff, on various issues. Just today, there was an issue that came up about the increase in the number of safety and security personnel. So I've been emailing back and forth with your Director of Safety and Security, trying to find out what's happened in Jeffco in that area. So I'm, in many ways, the conduit between state government and the state legislature and everybody at Jeffco schools.
Yeah. So, Ed, I have to tell you, I had an internship when I was in grad school at Kentucky, and it was with two lobbyists, one working for the Home Builders Association and one with the Manufactured Housing Association. So I learned a lot from those guys. And they told me that the first rule of lobbying was tell the truth. Because once you don't, you've sort of wrecked your credibility with the legislators, and you're cooked as far as being able to inform legislators, people in public policy around whatever issue that you're working on. So you're one of those people that give lobbyists a good name. We're proud to have you working for us. And now I want to shift things over to Representative Kennedy. Chris, tell us why education is so political. It seems like every year there's some kind of major disagreement under the Golden Dome related to education policy. And shouldn't this be something that everybody can come together and work on and agree on? So what gives? Why is education so political?
I think it's because it's so important. You know, political and partisan are two different things. We could say that it shouldn't be partisan, but everything's political because it has to do with how do we make our community and our society be what we want it to be. Education is something that touches everyone's lives, whether it was their own experience in school or whether it's what their kids are going through. And of course, we know the role the schools play in our community more broadly that impact our lives even if we don't have kids in these schools. So these issues are incredibly contentious. When we talk about school funding issues, and I know we're going to get into greater detail about that a little bit later on, but taxes are always a political conversation. How government is spending money is always a political conversation. And the stakes are high. People have strong feelings about what they want to see our schools doing because they feel strongly about what we leave for the next generation.
Right. It seems to me a lot that conversations in education are often sort of conflicts over competing and and positive values on both sides. So you have things like better funding for schools versus people being able to keep their money and driving economic development. And both of these are positive things. And the trick seems to be, how do you find ways to make these things work together, or hold both ideas in your heart and in your head at the same time. And even things like curriculum, we want students to be outside playing, having time at recess, developing social emotional skills, getting to be kids. Mm-hmm. We also want them to do well on assessments. We want them to have a challenging, rigorous academic experience. And so how do we balance both of those things? So it just seems like frequently there are these conflicts in values. What are some of, either one of you, what are some of your experiences in how those values play out? What are some of them that are brought into education, and sort of what are some of the different viewpoints on that?
So I'll add something to the list, another conflict that has been pretty relevant of late, and it has to do with accountability, which we all want, and also empowering teachers to have the tools they need to educate our kids, which is something we all want. And these things, it feels like they're in conflict, but the truth is I think it's about balance. And I think that good government is about finding the right balance between these kinds of competing priorities. So when we talk about testing, for example, well, you want to make sure you're doing enough testing that we're accurately measuring what's going on in our schools, that if there is a problem, we're able to identify it early and rectify the situation, because at the end of the day, it is all about making sure our kids are getting the quality education they deserve. But at the same time, I think we've seen in certain instances when we go too far down the road with testing, then our teachers have to spend all their time filling out forms and compiling data rather than developing their lesson plans and spending one-on-one time with kids. So you have to figure out the appropriate balance. And at the state legislature, we're constantly recalibrating those things. So when testing conversations may seem settled one year, they'll come back again a few years later because, at least from someone's perspective, they are out of balance, and we seek to fix that.
Yeah, I had a conversation with the former governor of North Carolina, Jim Hunt, once, and he talked about there's this constant balance of pressure and support that you have to consider as a policymaker, and he was clear to say you have to have both. Ed, what are your thoughts around this?
I think testing is a great example. That is something that there were federal mandates, there were state policies, and then there were district policies. And sometimes they were in conflict. We had a number of legislators who finally decided enough is enough. They heard from what we called angry parents who came down to the Capitol and said, my child is being tested way too much. So the legislature responded. That was the big K-12 issue about 3 sessions ago, and it wasn't resolved until the last night of the session. It was not partisan at all. There was no clear division in terms of Democrats versus Republicans. There were some people who wanted to make sure we had clear expectations for testing, and other people who said we have too much testing. Schools ought to be governed by their school districts and by their local neighborhoods. But I think we now have a compromise to where I don't think that issue is going to be brought up anytime soon.
Yeah, and I know that in politics and in the legislature, just the whole national conversation around politics right now has left a bad taste in everybody's mouth, just how acrimonious it is. But I see a lot of times in the legislature, you really find areas where people work together and a lot happens. Like there's bipartisan or nonpartisan collaboration and unity around issues. So what are some areas you can think of in education over the past few years? You mentioned the testing issue where we've been able to come together and get something positive done for our schools.
Certainly the testing issue brought a lot of people together. The state legislature really, and I've worked there since 1987, as you mentioned earlier, seen a lot of legislatures come and go, but in Colorado, it really works pretty well, regardless of party control. We have had a budget pass every year. We've had a School Finance Act pass every year. Sometimes it's close, but they, typically 300-400 bills are passed each year. Another area of focus that has brought a lot of people together in recent years is concurrent enrollment. I think a lot of people in the legislature see the value of concurrent enrollment, engaging students in high school to do post-secondary work. It helps them not only stay excited about high school, but it also helps them if they go on to college. They already have some credits. Career and tech education. Here we are at North Campus of Warren Tech. Career and tech has gotten a lot of focus as a way to open up a whole new world of options for students.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that too. This emphasis on making sure there are pathways for kids that may not necessarily be college bound is an incredibly important conversation. This one is not a partisan issue at all. I've been hearing folks talk about it for several years now out in the community, and I'm seeing both Democrats and Republicans expressing more support for it and trying to brainstorm about what we can do. And I know our current Jeffco school board has been working hard on this issue, and we're exploring that. If we had passed 3B in 2016, we would have had a Warren Tech South campus in the works. And I think that's still a prerogative that a lot of people in this community support, regardless of their politics.
Right, yeah. So one of the issues that comes up every single year that seems to be really contentious, and even it goes to the very end of the session, it seems like every time, is this conversation around school funding. So why is this so contentious, and what are some of the things that the legislature can do, and what are some of the constraints that are placed on the legislature as far as addressing funding issues in the state?
It's good softball for you.
It's contentious because it's about money, and it's about how we fund our critical priorities. And every money conversation you have at the Capitol is tough. I think it's really important to understand the history in Colorado. We have a very unique budget situation because of a constitutional amendment passed in 1992 and another one passed in 1982. The hands of the legislature are tied more than in any other state in the country, such that we do not have the authority to raise taxes. Our growth of our budget is actually ratcheted down because of a formula that's built in the Constitution, and our residential property taxes are actually ratcheted down because of the 1982 ballot measure, the Gallagher Amendment. And so what that has meant is that government, relative to the size of our economy, has been shrinking for the last 25 years, such that K-12 schools, higher education, transportation infrastructure, mental health, affordable housing, and numerous other priorities have all had to cut as much as possible. And so when you look at where we are in the year 2017, even though the economy is growing and we have the best economy in the country according to some measures, we're still underfunding our K-12 schools by $2,600 per kid per year compared to the national average. Our college tuition rates are through the roof because the state hasn't been able to adequately fund it. At the same time, there are many who feel that taxes are too high. I'm not one of those. I believe that our tax system is currently not adequate to fund the needs of this state, but that's really the core of this conversation. It's not that people don't want to see more support for schools. It's that they don't want to talk about taxes.
Right. So the legislature only really controls half of the equation. You control where the dollars go, but not the revenue or the intake side.
Well, and even that half we don't have full control over because there are a number of formulas built into both our Constitution and a number of processes in state law. So our discretion over the budget is just a fraction of the overall state budget.
Yeah, well, let's talk about one of those. Maybe, Ed, you can jump in here. So Amendment 23, I think there's an element of the state constitution that's supposed to guarantee increases to K-12 education. What happened with that?
Passed in 2000, it said that the legislature was required to fund education, all the new students, and then fund the inflation rate plus 1% for 10 years, and then inflation thereafter. The legislature took a very strict reading of that when it passed for the first few years. Through the 2001-2002 major recession, education was not cut. The rest of the budget took all of those cuts. Starting in 2008, however, the legislature had an opinion from their attorneys that said, look, do we have to follow this to the letter? Amendment 23 did not say you couldn't put a negative factor onto the end of the School Finance Act. So what they did is they increased the funding per Amendment 23, and then they put a negative factor to back out the funding. That negative factor is still in effect, has a different name, the Budget Stabilization Factor. I won't go into the acronym, but the negative factor, now Budget Stabilization Factor, what does that mean for Jeffco? Jeffco schools, according to the Budget Stabilization Factor, is short $75 million.
Every year?
Every year, year in, year out. The Budget Stabilization Factor has been brought down a little bit. It's currently $828 million statewide. Jeffco is always about 9% of everything on the statewide level. So Jeffco's share of that is $75 million. If there's any way for Representative Kennedy and his colleagues to end the negative factor, I would call you and say, you just got $75 million back. But there's no budget box. As Representative Kennedy just said, there is no way for them to raise taxes. They could cut all the money going to state, to public higher education, and that would equal roughly be the same amount as the budget stabilization factor, which you're not going to do. You're not going to defund higher ed and have tuition triple overnight just to end the negative factor. The legislature is in a box. They can't raise revenue, and they've got this Amendment 23 thing that many of them would like to end, but they can't.
Yeah, and what's further complicating this is the way the Gallagher Amendment has ratcheted down the residential property taxes. So while we're seeing a reduction in the state's ability to fund our school districts, we're simultaneously seeing forced reductions in the property tax revenues that the districts can bring in themselves. It is such a mess, and I think a number of us would really like to be having a statewide conversation. I think we are having a statewide conversation about it. It just kind of feels like it's in the bubble a little bit, and we need to get out there in the community more broadly. But the BS factor is really a problem, and it's even if we were still meeting the obligation of Amendment 23 without the reductions that are in place because of the BS factor.
The budget stabilization factor.
The budget
right.
stabilization factor, sorry. We use a lot of acronyms in government, some of which are more comical than others. But even if we were fully meeting the obligation of Amendment 23, that's still not what I would consider adequate funding of our schools. That still wouldn't really quite catch us up to where we need to be to provide the quality of education we need, to pay the teachers like the professionals they are, such that we can keep people in the teaching profession rather than seeing them go look for more lucrative industries to work in. We're at a place where we're underserving our kids in a lot of cases because we're unable to make the investments we need in their future.
Right. Well, on behalf of all of us with Jeffco Public Schools, we want to make sure that all of our legislators know how grateful we are of their support. We know that you are in a tough situation in terms of available revenue and dollars, and we know that all of you have gone to bat for Jeffco Public Schools, so we're just appreciative of that and grateful. Let's think ahead to this next legislative session. In addition to the sort of ongoing funding issues that we know are going to come up, what other things are bubbling up or going to be on the horizon? What should we expect is going to be the big thing around education and really in the legislature this coming session?
One thing, and I don't know exactly what form this is going to take yet, but at the end of the last legislative session, there was a compromise reached with some of the charter school advocates who wanted to see a program to require a different kind of sharing of mill levy override dollars with the charter schools. Now, Jeffco had already been doing this and sharing these revenues, but a number of other districts were not. Well, this was a big contentious fight that I'm hoping is completely put to bed and does not have to come back, but what that set the stage for is a funding conversation. We have an interim committee process, so when the legislature is not in session, we have a certain number of interim committees that are approved to continue meeting and discussing these issues. And we approved a 2-year interim committee last year that is dealing with these education finance issues. And I'm not exactly sure what they're going to recommend, if anything, for this next session, but at some point in time, I think they are going to come back with some ideas of whether we need to ask the voters for a tax increase to increase our support for our public education system.
That interim committee has already met twice, and they have a few more meetings on the calendar. They have talked about how other states allocate their monies through their school finance acts, and are there examples that Colorado should adopt. So, for example, one of the first issues that came up was a different student count. Right now, we have the so-called one-day count. Mm-hmm. Should we look at an average daily membership or an average daily attendance to better reflect who's actually in each district? The interim committee will continue to look at issues like that, and then hopefully also look at the resource issue. Do we have adequate resources going into K-12 education?
We've heard some talk around the big issue being in this coming legislative session being changes to PARA, or the Public Employees Retirement System in Colorado. What are the proposals out there, and what should we expect around that?
There are proposals every year to impact PARA. PARA is certainly an issue that gets a lot of people's attention down there. There are some legislators who want to immediately end the state's public employee defined benefit retirement program and shift all employees to more of a 401k, a defined contribution program. That would be very difficult and frankly costly to do, the studies have indicated. The current proposal para has floated would impact current para members, future para members, and retirees. They are proposing a package of reforms that will likely end up being introduced in the 2018 session. The last time they did this, what was called the shared sacrifice in 2010, there were increases in para rates, changes to the inflation rate, and changes to people who had not been hired, people who were not vested in para at that point. This is very similar to that in that they would address all of those major areas. It will generate a lot of discussion at the legislature.
I think it's important to talk about why we're having this conversation again, especially for those who were watching the legislature closely in 2010 when we passed a bill that was thought to be a long-term solution for para. The actuaries who look at these things do the best they can with the data that's available at the time. They made the best projections they could based on how long people were expected to live and what we thought the rates of return were likely to be in the market. And the 2010 legislation was designed to solve those problems. Well, since then, the actuaries have continued to be hard at work, and there have been a few updates made. One is they have updated the mortality tables because people are living longer. And simply put, that increases the cost of the retirement program while not necessarily increasing the money that goes into it. Secondly, there were a couple rocky years in there where the rate of return was not what it was expected to be, even though I think that the para board made a pretty responsible decision with what they were calculating with the information that was available. But as we look for the long run, I think there's pretty strong agreement across the board that we do need to adjust the system, and again, with an approach of shared sacrifice so that we can make sure this program is sustainable for the long run.
Great, thank you. Chris, I want to stay with you for just a minute. A couple of weeks ago, Jeffco released a new vision document for the community to consider called Jeffco Generations, a learning-centered vision for our community schools. I wonder if you've had a chance to look over that and any thoughts or reactions you might have about that. We're really just trying to have a conversation with the community about what fit, what didn't, what might be missing, and just some reactions.
I wish I'd had more time to spend with it, but what I have seen that I really appreciate is that we're not just talking about the environment in the classroom. We're talking about the situations that impact kids' lives, that impact their ability to learn when they get to the classroom. Recognizing the fact that there are some kids who are going to be reading before they start kindergarten and others that are not. Recognizing that there are some kids whose parents are working multiple jobs and may not be able to spend that extra time and effort with them. Recognizing that there are kids who may not get breakfast before they go to school in the morning, or they may not have a safe, comfortable environment to go to study when they get home. So thinking about that broadly, and I want to mention, we did this tour of schools yesterday. Great Education Colorado set up this series of visits for legislators and legislative candidates. And I visited 4 schools in Jeffco yesterday, the last of which was Jefferson Junior Senior High, who is implementing this new community schools initiative, which is just a modification on what they'd been doing for a long time. But one of the things that I think is really exciting and innovative about this program is rather than pointing the finger at parents who may not be engaged in their kids' education, they're finding new ways to invite the parents into the schools to engage them. And that's by, if there are people who need help with public benefits, whether that be Medicaid or housing or anything else, the school is a place where they can go to find out how to access that information. And then they start to develop those relationships with the teachers and the administrators in the school in a way that I think is really going to be beneficial for those kids in the long run.
Great, thank you. Ed, anything you'd weigh in on this? Are there things that are the right fit, the wrong fit? Are we headed in the right direction with this Jeffco Generations vision?
I think it's extremely comprehensive. When I look over and I see things like content mastery, civic and global engagement, self-direction, critical thinking, those are very important skills, and those are exactly the skills that the community should want in its public schools. I go back to, I'm 54, we didn't have this full range of attributes when I was growing up, so I think it's a great tribute to the district to really think broadly about what does a current K-12 education mean, and what do our students need stepping out into the 21st century?
Right. Thank you. Well, and we're really excited about it and excited about these conversations that we're having with the community, with the big idea being that that sort of content mastery or factual knowledge is still important, but it's no longer enough. Anything that's sort of repetitious, fact routine based, those kinds of jobs have already left our country and they're never coming back. So how do we give kids a strong content mastery, but also give them the chance to practice these other important skills that you mentioned? So finally, I'd like to end with what I think is a very important question that our listeners are going to want to know your opinion on, and we desperately need your expertise. We're recording here at Warren Tech North. We have a wonderful staff of students that are helping us, but we're in the wake of the Broncos' recent loss to the Giants. And so what is going on with the Denver Broncos, and what can we do about this? And Chris, you're an architectural engineer. We had 2 missed field goals that should have been chip-ins. Is there something with the wind dynamics at Mile High Stadium? Just what's happening?
I'm not sure how much I can use my engineering background to inform this. And I am ashamed to say I didn't actually have a chance to watch the game. I've been working a little bit too hard these days. And
well, you didn't miss much, so.
Maybe I'll defer this question to my friend Ed.
I'd say didn't grow up here in Colorado, but certainly know the depth of the love for the Broncos. I'm always amazed by the discussions about the quarterback. Do we have the right quarterback? And those
Trevor
discussions.
had a great game.
Yeah.
He threw for 375 yards or something. So
You know, the one thing I think I can say is we have an incredibly talented group of running backs, and it seems like an embarrassment of riches, such that as long as Simeon is able to put the ball in one of their hands, that we're going to make a little bit of progress. And I'm always amazed by what C.J. Anderson can do, just bobbing and weaving down the field.
Well, there you have it. We need to do something with the wind dynamics at the stadium, and we need to give the ball, put the ball in the ground more. That's our recipe for success. Well, thanks everybody for listening in. That brings this edition of Jeffco Public Schools Talking Ed to a close. I want to thank both of our gracious and knowledgeable guests, Representative Chris Kennedy and Jeffco Public Schools lobbyist Ed Bowditch, for taking the time to be on the show. Once again, I'm Jason Glass, proud to be the superintendent and chief learner with Jeffco Public Schools. Until next time, support your local public school. Thank you.